The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song at 0600, a sound like electricity learning to sing. St. Michael's ICU in San Antonio smelled like antiseptic mixed with the ghost of burnt coffee, the kind that had been circling the nurse's station since midnight shift. Hannah Clarke moved through the unit with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that perfection was the only acceptable standard. Her hands were steady as surgical steel when she touched a patient. When idle, they trembled like leaves in wind. 3 weeks. That's how long she'd been here, assigned to the ICU with a cover identity so clean it could withstand a background check run by people who actually knew what they were looking for. Nobody here knew that. Nobody needed to know that. Her locker was on the 3rd row, back corner, next to the old defibrillator they kept as backup. Inside, a photograph of her 8-year-old daughter Sophie in a soccer uniform, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. A burner phone that vibrated exactly twice daily at 0900 and 1800, intelligence updates, coded in hospital supply requests. Unfolded with military precision, pressed under a small clear case, an American flag. The flag had been presented to her 4 years ago by a sergeant major with hands that shook, because the flag had draped a coffin, and the name on the coffin read Staff Sergeant Maria Vega, KIA Ramadi 2019. Maria had been Hannah's friend. More than a friend. The kind of friendship that forms only when two people have held each other together while the world exploded. The flag stayed in the locker during shifts. Hannah wore only her cover, blue scrubs, stethoscope, a name badge that read H. Clarke RN, St. Michael's Medical Center. The rank of captain remained buried so deep that even her own hands forgot to salute. Room 347 was her primary assignment. Corporal Derek Jensen, 26 years old, admitted 72 hours ago from Landstuhl Regional Medical Center via medical transport. Traumatic brain injury sustained from an IED blast in Ramadi, Jolan District, 6 weeks prior. His chart listed no family, no emergency contact, no visitors. The official story was that he'd survived an explosion that killed 2 other Marines in his fire team, and that the blast had scrambled something essential in his skull. The unofficial story, the one that never made it to medical records, was that Jensen had been on an intelligence collection mission when the device detonated, and that he'd extracted classified information before the blast radius expanded. That information was why she was here. Jensen lay in the hospital bed like a man who was learning to be human again. His eyes moved sometimes, tracking the ceiling, the window, a nurse's face. But the tracking was wrong. Wrong the way a computer cursor is wrong when its driver is updating software. There was a person in there somewhere, but the connections weren't complete. Not yet. Traumatic brain injury didn't follow a timeline. Recovery was negotiation with a stranger wearing your own face. On his right forearm, in block letters that had been tattooed with the precision of someone who knew how to put permanent marks on human skin, was the text H. Clarke. Just those 2 letters and 1 word. No rank. No branch designation. Just a name, and underneath it, the ghost of what looked like a unit insignia, partially faded by desert sun. Hannah checked his 4 lines. She adjusted the flow rate on his normal saline, 500 milliliters per hour, standard post-TBI protocol. She noted the time in her charting. 0620. Vitals stable. Pupils responsive. No change in level of consciousness. The charting was immaculate, because sloppy charting was how people died, and Hannah Clarke did not allow people to die on her watch. Not if she could prevent it. Morning, Corporal, she said, keeping her voice soft and even, the voice of a nurse who was just a nurse, nothing more. How are we feeling today? Jensen's eyes moved toward her voice, but the focus didn't quite arrive. His mouth worked without sound, the way it did most mornings. She'd checked the swallow studies yesterday. There was neural pathway damage affecting his ability to coordinate the muscles. Aspiration risk remained at moderate. He was on soft diet, thickened liquids only. You're doing good, Hannah said, and checked the monitor. Heart rate 72. O2 sat 97. Blood pressure 118/80. Everything textbook perfect. She reached for his wrist and felt the pulse, strong, regular, the rhythm of a young man's heart. She'd felt a lot of pulses. She'd felt pulses stop under her fingertips. She'd felt pulses come back to life when she'd forced them to. This pulse was just talking to her, telling her that Derek Jensen was still fighting. Hannah's hand stilled against his arm, and for exactly 2 seconds, her composure cracked the way old ice cracks under weight. The tattoo. She'd been briefed on it, of course. The Pentagon had explained it to her in a secure briefing room at Walter Reed. The tattoo was how Jensen had hidden the intelligence officer's contact information on his own body, Clarke, his handler. The name that meant she was meant to protect him while he recovered, meant to monitor his condition, meant to extract him if anything went wrong. But seeing it on his skin like that, knowing what it cost him to have it there, knowing what it had cost her to be the person on the other end of that call sign. She pulled her hand back and made a note. "We're going to get some PT in today, okay? Just the gentle stuff. Nothing that pushes too hard." Jensen's eyes followed her as she turned to leave. She could feel them on her back. People always sensed something when they'd been broken together, even if they couldn't quite remember why. Dr. Marcus Pierce was standing at the physician's workstation when she returned. He was a tall man with the kind of build that suggested he'd played tennis in his 40s, the kind of face that suggested he'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. 52 years old, chief of surgery, published researcher, board member of 3 hospital committees. His eyes were on a computer screen, but they weren't really looking at it. They were waiting for her. She felt the moment his attention locked onto her like a tactical scope acquiring a target. "Ms. Clarke," he said, and the way he said the name was like watching someone taste something bitter. A moment. She walked over. Every step was measured. Every breath was controlled. This was the part of the cover that required the most precision, appearing small. Appearing harmless. Appearing like the kind of nurse that senior physicians overlooked, the kind that stayed quiet and followed orders and never asked questions about supply chain discrepancies or phantom equipment charges. The thing was, Hannah had noticed the discrepancies on day 4. It was hard not to notice them when you'd spent 12 years in military intelligence learning how to spot patterns in data. Dr. Pierce had been submitting purchase orders for surgical equipment that didn't exist. Retrograde pressure irrigation systems. Laparoscopic insufflators. Advanced hemostasis devices. The orders were consistently overpriced by 15 to 20%, and the vendors listed were shell companies registered in Delaware. The money wasn't disappearing, it was being diverted. Probably to a medical distributor that was kicking back the difference in some form or another. Probably to Pierce's personal account. Which was interesting, but not Hannah's problem. Her problem was Jensen. Everything else was noise. She'd submitted 3 supply discrepancy reports in the last 2 weeks. Small ones. Nothing that would draw attention. Just the kind of thing a meticulous nurse would notice during routine charting. Just the kind of thing that happened in hospitals all the time. "Yes, Dr. Pierce. Your charting is quite detailed," he said. He was looking at her now, and his eyes were the color of a shark's eye, present, intelligent, and absolutely lacking in mercy. Almost obsessively so. "I believe thorough documentation is essential to patient safety, sir." "Of course." He smiled, but his teeth didn't show. "And these supply reports you've been submitting? They're quite detailed as well. Almost as though you have some particular interest in the hospital's procurement processes." Hannah's hands remained at her sides. Her breathing remained steady. Her voice remained measured. "I only report discrepancies when I notice them, doctor. It's part of my responsibility to the hospital." He turned back to his screen. "Well, let's not worry about procurement. That's administration's concern. Your concern is the patient's. Yes? Yes, doctor. Good. Then perhaps you might focus your attention there. I've noticed you spend a great deal of time with Corporal Jensen. More time than his condition would ordinarily warrant." Hannah felt the trap closing, the way you feel a neck closing when you're already inside it. But her face didn't change. Her composure held like reinforced concrete. Here's a significant care need. Traumatic brain injury requires frequent neuro checks. Indeed. Every 30 minutes. When indicated, yes. Pierce leaned back in his chair. It was a leather chair that probably cost more than Hannah made in 6 months. The problem with excessive attention to particular patients, he said softly, is that people begin to notice patterns. People begin to ask questions. And questions can become very destructive things, Ms. Clarke. Wouldn't you agree? The threat wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. It was meant to make her understand that he knew something was wrong with her story, and that he was going to apply pressure until something cracked. Hannah had been threatened before. She'd been threatened by men with weapons. She'd been threatened by interrogators in rooms without windows. The threats didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was the mission. I'm just trying to provide good nursing care, doctor. Of course you are. He turned back to his work. Do carry on, then. But perhaps keep your attention to what's necessary. Nothing more. She walked away without another word. That was the thing about being a ghost. You learned early that the most powerful response was often no response at all. You moved through the world and left no trace, asked no questions, volunteered nothing. You became so small that people forgot they were supposed to be suspicious. But Dr. Pierce wouldn't forget. She'd activated something in him the moment she'd filed that first report. The survival instinct of a predator who realizes there's another predator in its territory. Hannah was halfway back to Jensen's room when her burner phone vibrated against her ribs. Once. Twice. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She already knew the message. The protocol was simple. 2 vibrations meant incoming intelligence. 0900. She'd check it during her break, in the bathroom stall, where cameras didn't reach. In room 347, Jensen was staring at his arm. At the tattoo. At the name that meant something he couldn't quite remember, something important enough to carve into his own flesh. That's going to be okay, Hannah said, and she meant it. You're going to be okay. Jensen's eyes found her face, and for just a moment, barely a fraction of a second, something flickered there. Recognition. Memory. The ghost of who he used to be. Then it was gone again, and he was just a confused young man in a hospital bed, with a tattoo he couldn't explain and a past he couldn't access. Hannah pulled a chair over and sat beside him. She didn't say anything. She just stayed there, her presence a kind of anchor, a reminder that somewhere in the broken circuits of his mind, someone was keeping count. Someone was remembering. Someone was waiting for him to come back. The board was red. That's what Hannah noticed first as she entered the unit at 0630, not the words, not the letters arranged in Dr. Pierce's precise handwriting, but the color. Red marker on the white surface, impossible to miss, positioned at eye level where every nurse would pass during morning rounds. Clarke, med error, morphine timing. Below it, in smaller letters, disciplinary action pending. She had administered morphine to post-op patient in 442 at 1,417 hours. The order timestamp read 1400. 17 minutes. In the 12 years she'd served with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, she'd coordinated supply drops under fire with less precision than she kept medication schedules. But that wasn't the point. The point was the red marker. The point was that everyone would see it. By 0645, the morning rounds team had assembled, 7 nurses, for residents, 2 medical students. Pierce entered carrying the patient charts like weapons, his eyes already fixed on Hannah. She stood at the far end of the group, her hands at her sides, her badge hanging at the exact regulation angle. Waiting. Before we begin, Pierce said, uncapping the red marker again with the deliberate care of someone drawing a weapon, I want to address a pattern that's developing. He didn't look at Hannah. That was the cruelty, he spoke about her as if she wasn't there. When a nurse cannot follow basic protocols, patients suffer. Ms. Clarke administered pain medication 17 minutes late to a post-op patient in for 42. 17 minutes of unnecessary suffering because someone couldn't read a clock. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The sound was like teeth grinding, the noise you heard in your chest before an IED detonation alert cut through radio static. Hannah's jaw tightened, just barely, just enough that she could feel the muscle cord at the corner of her mouth. She said nothing. Around her, the other nurses exchanged glances, quick and nervous, the way prey animals acknowledge a predator in the room. I expect nurses who can tell time, Pierce continued, turning now to address the group directly, as if Hannah were a teaching moment, a case study in incompetence. Is that too much to ask, Nurse Tardy? 2 residents smirked. One of them was new, barely into his second week of rotations, the kind who didn't yet understand that humiliation in a hospital was currency that circulated upward, that laughing with an attending was how you got good letters of recommendation. Hannah's voice, when it came, was flat as concrete. The patient's chart shows I was on time, Dr. Pierce. Pierce smiled. The smile was worse than the insult. It was the smile of someone who had already won. You're charting, he said softly, in a tone designed to suggest that her documentation was suspect, that perhaps her records themselves were fabrications. How convenient. He moved on to the next patient without waiting for a response. Hannah's hands remained at her sides. Her face remained unreadable, not the absence of expression, but rather the precise architecture of someone who had learned long ago that control was the only currency that mattered when everything else had been taken. She had sat in a briefing room in Ramadi and listened to intelligence assessments about 3 missing Marines. She had dressed down a junior enlisted corpsman who'd contaminated a sterile field under enemy fire. She had done harder things in silence. By 0800, she was in room 319 with Mr. Garrett, a 63-year-old cardiac patient who'd come out of surgery at 0600 and was now resting against 3 pillows, his daughter sitting in the vinyl chair beside him and his son-in-law standing by the window. Hannah was checking the foresight, the catheter was clean, the line running clear, the pump delivering fluids at exactly the rate ordered. She was adjusting the flow rate when Pierce entered with the family already aware of his presence, already composed and waiting. Ms. Clarke, this is the second time I've had to correct your negligent care of this patient, Pierce announced, his voice rising deliberately so that it filled the small room like smoke. The family deserves better than a nurse who cuts corners. Hannah's hands continued their work. Steady. The kind of steady that comes from having threaded sutures while incoming fire tore through a field hospital tent. Her face remained an unreadable mask, not blank, but controlled, the way water appears still until you understand the current running beneath. Mr. Garrett's vitals are stable, she said quietly, her eye still on the fall line. His care plan is current. I'll be reassigning a more experienced nurse to your father's care, Pierce said, turning to the family with an expression of deepest concern, as if he were comforting them through a tragedy. You have my apologies for the delay in catching these errors. He left. The daughter wouldn't look at Hannah now. The son-in-law had already turned back to the window. Hannah finished the for adjustment and left the room without saying anything else. In the hallway, a nurse named Stephanie from the evening shift was coming the other direction. She saw Hannah and suddenly became very interested in her phone, stepping aside with the minimum social courtesy, not a nod, not eye contact, just the spatial acknowledgement of an obstacle being moved. By day 12, the isolation was architectural. Pierce had revised the master schedule. Hannah's breaks now fell during shift changes when the ICU lounge was always empty, that 14-minute window at 1400 when the day shift was handing off to evening, when everyone was clustered at the nurse's station or running final checks. At exactly 1400, Hannah entered the break room to find 4 nurses at the table, Rodriguez from cardiac, Chen from trauma, Briggs from post-op, and Martinez from her own unit. They saw her. They exchanged glances, brief, communicative. Then they moved. Rodriguez gathered her lunch container. Chen checked her phone with sudden urgency. Briggs remembered something she'd forgotten at the station. Martinez simply stood and walked past Hannah toward the door, not meeting her eyes, not apologizing, just acknowledging the social mathematics that made her presence unwelcome. Within 90 seconds, the room was empty except for the hum of the refrigerator and the smell of reheated coffee. Hannah sat down with her own lunch, a sandwich she'd prepared that morning, and a cup of black coffee. The cup was warm. Her hands didn't shake. That would have been easier, she thought. Shaking hands would have given permission for what she was feeling, would have transformed it into something visible, something that could be acknowledged. Instead, she wrapped both hands around the cup as if to hide them, though there was no one there to see them. She stared at the wall for 14 minutes. The wall was beige. There was a bulletin board with outdated hospital announcements and a flyer about flu shots from 6 months ago. She memorized the details. It helped not to think about the Marines she'd served with, the ones who didn't make it out of Ramadi, the ones for whom she'd kept a folded flag in her locker like a prayer she couldn't speak. At 14:14, she drank the coffee without tasting it and returned to the floor. Her medication pass was at 1500, which meant she had 45 minutes to chart, review orders, and prepare. Pierce had implemented a new system 3 days ago. All her entries now required his secondary approval before they were finalized in the system. What once took 2 minutes now took 40. What once was her clinical decision was now his decision, made with deliberate slowness, forcing her to stand at the station waiting for his electronic signature while other nurses worked their patients, and the implicit message hung in the air like antiseptic: "You are not trusted. You are not capable. You are not welcome here." That evening, after her shift ended at 2100, Hannah drove to the parking lot at the northern edge of San Antonio where the sky was still holding on to the last copper light of sunset. Her burner phone was in the zippered pocket of her work bag. She pulled it out and read the message waiting: condition update on asset. The language was sanitized. Asset. That meant Jensen. Asset meant he was still part of the mission, still intelligence that needed to be protected, still her responsibility even though her badge access was being systematically revoked and her credibility was being dismantled one red mark annotation at a time. She typed, stable. Neuro improving. TBI still present. No recall at this time. The response came in 90 seconds, timeline accelerating. Asset being transferred via San Antonio in 72 hours and less clarity achieved. Chinese operatives confirmed in city. If asset recalls before extraction, compromise is certain. Maintain cover at all costs. Hannah deleted the thread. She watched the message history vanish from the screen, just like that, gone, untraceable, the same way operations disappeared once they were finished. She sat in her car as the last light drained from the sky and thought about what it meant to maintain cover when the cover was actively being destroyed, when the person she was pretending to be, just a nurse, just someone following hospital protocol, just someone who could be publicly humiliated in front of her peers without consequence, that person was being erased by the very person who needed her most. She thought about Jensen in room 347, staring at the tattoo on his forearm with confusion in his eyes because his brain was still rebuilding the neural pathways that connected that symbol to her face. She thought about the folded flag in her locker, the one from Martinez. His real last name was irrelevant, everyone called him by his call sign anyway, the one who'd taken a round meant for her in Ramadi and never made it back. And she thought about the fact that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns, and that sometimes being a soldier meant surrendering everything about yourself in order to save someone else's life. The next morning, Hannah arrived at 0530 for early setup. The unit board had been updated. The red mark annotation remained. She didn't look at it as she passed. She simply registered its presence the way you register obstacles, process it, acknowledge it, move through it. By 0645, Dr. Pierce was reviewing his carefully constructed schedule for the week, and by 0800, Hannah's isolation was so complete that when she asked Rodriguez to sign off on a patient transfer form, the other nurse simply said she was busy and walked away, leaving Hannah holding the paperwork and understanding that the next phase had begun. The badge reader beeped red. Access denied. Hannah stared at the small electronic panel mounted beside the ICU entrance, watching the light cycle from green to red, as if the machine itself was blinking in disbelief. Behind her, the hallway of St. Michael's stretched quiet and fluorescent white, the kind of silence that only exists in hospitals between shift changes. She pressed her badge again. Read. Again. Read. The email had arrived at 1,147 hours, routed through hospital administration with the clinical precision of a surgical strike. Probationary limitations pending peer review. Badge access restricted to unit for postoperative ward only, effective immediately. Approved by Chief of Medicine Dr. Holloway and attending physician Dr. Marcus Pierce. The language was so carefully constructed, so perfectly bureaucratic, that it took Hannah 3 reads to understand what had actually happened. She had been surgically removed from her patient. She turned away from the locked door and found Dr. Pierce standing 12 feet down the corridor, watching her. He wasn't trying to hide it. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, the posture of a man who had already won and wanted her to know it. His face held the expression of someone savoring the final move in a game where he'd been playing for 3 weeks and she'd only now realized they were competing at all. "Your new rotation starts at 1400, he said, voice smooth as silk over broken glass. Post-op wing seed Rodriguez will take over Jensen's care." Hannah's jaw tightened. 1 breath. 2. She looked at him without speaking, and watched something flicker across his face, a brief flash of frustration that she hadn't argued, hadn't protested, hadn't given him the satisfaction of her reaction. Her composure was a mirror, and he hated seeing himself reflected in it. "I documented his symptoms," Hannah said quietly. "Decreased breath sounds on the right. Oxygen saturation 89% at 1,400 hours. That's in the chart." "Then Rodriguez will continue to monitor," Pierce replied, already turning away. "You'll transfer your notes at shift change." "That's all, Ms. Clarke." She stood in the hallway for another 30 seconds, watching the space where he'd been. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a sound like distant insects. A crash cart squeaked past, pushed by an orderly who didn't look at her. A monitor beeped somewhere behind a closed door. The hospital moved on, indifferent, while Hannah Clarke became smaller and smaller in its machinery. By 1300 hours, she had packed her locker. It wasn't much: a spare stethoscope, 2 protein bars, a small container of black coffee she'd made that morning and never finished drinking. At the bottom, wrapped in white cloth, was the folded flag. SSGT Marcus Vega, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, Ramadi, 2008. He had carried her call sign tattooed on his shoulder blade, Angel 6, because she'd pulled him out of a collapsed building with a sucking chest wound and a prayer. He'd bled out anyway, 6 days later, on a transport helicopter over the Euphrates River. The flag had come to her folded into a perfect triangle, pressed into her hands by a chaplain who didn't know her real name. She kept her hand steady as she placed it in her personal locker. Not trembling. Not shaking. Just moving through the ritual of being expelled as if it was routine, as if it was something she'd planned for, as if her entire operation wasn't now unraveling in real time. The call came at 1,547 hours. Encrypted line. She answered on the second ring. "Status," the voice said. "Not a question." "Reassigned off ICU," Hannah replied, keeping her voice level despite standing in the stairwell of the hospital where anyone could overhear. "Transferred to post-op wing C at 1,400 hours. New nurse assigned to Jensen, Rodriguez replacement. 23 years old, first month on floor. Can you regain access?" "Negative." Pierce pulled my badge authorization through administration. Chief of Medicine signed off. "I'm locked out of the unit and the scheduling system." The silence on the line lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Our window closes at 0600 tomorrow. He moves or the threat develops. Your call." Hannah closed her eyes. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to blend into the background of fluorescent lights and beeping monitors and the 1,000 small moments where no one looked twice at a nurse in scrubs. She was supposed to watch and wait and let the operation unfold according to the mission parameters she'd been briefed on 3 weeks ago. Instead, she was visible. She was noticed. She was being systematically removed from the board. "I'll fix it," she said. "How?" She didn't answer because she didn't know, not yet, and the voice on the other end of the encrypted line knew better than to push a captain when the answer was silence. The call ended with a soft click. The 1400 to 2200 shift in post-op Wing C was like watching someone else's life unfold in a hospital she no longer recognized. The post-operative patients were straightforward, routine monitoring, post-anesthesia recovery, the kind of predictable medical timeline where nothing unexpected happened. Hannah moved through it with the muscle memory of someone who had done this work for 8 years, checking vitals, documenting intake and output, ensuring pain management protocols were followed. She was competent. She was invisible. She was completely separated from the one patient who mattered. At 18:15 hours, she walked past the ICU entrance and saw Rodriguez through the glass window, sitting at Jensen's bedside, scrolling through her phone while her patient lay sleeping, chest still rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of his healing. Rodriguez was a good nurse, young, eager, capable. She would follow Pierce's protocols perfectly. She would not question unnecessary orders. She would not save lives in ways that required improvisation. Hannah kept walking. At 19:30 hours, she called the ICU from the post-op station and asked Rodriguez directly. "How's the patient in 4 to 12? Jensen?" "He's doing great actually," Rodriguez said, bright and oblivious. "Sleeping right now, SATs are 94, heart rate steady. Dr. Pierce stopped by earlier and said to just keep doing what we're doing." 94%. That was better. Maybe Jensen's lungs were already compensating. Maybe she'd been wrong about the imaging. Maybe this was all going to be fine. She didn't believe any of it. At 2145 hours, she changed out of her scrubs in the locker room that wasn't her locker room anymore. The basement storage area was institutional and cold and smelled like cleaning chemicals and old linens. She placed her hospital badge on the shelf, not her neck where it belonged. Tomorrow she would pick it up and try to access the ICU, and the red light would blink again, and nothing would have changed except that now everyone would know she had tried. She drove home through San Antonio rain, the kind of rain that fell sideways and hammered the windshield like applause from people who didn't understand what they were clapping for. By 22:47 hours, she was standing in her kitchen doorway, watching her 8-year-old daughter Sophie color at the dinner table, and she understood with perfect clarity that she was about to lie to the person she loved most. Surprised in a night. Sophie looked up with a smile, marker in hand, the kind of pure uncomplicated happiness that belonged to children who didn't know anything about classified missions or military protocols or mothers who weren't really mothers, not officially, not on any paperwork that mattered. Hannah smiled back. Surprised in a night. She made pasta, Sophie's favorite, and they ate together while the rain continued its assault on the windows, and Hannah asked about school and drawings and the spelling test Sophie had worried about all week. She was fully present. She was completely absent. She was a mother and a captain and a ghost all at the same time, and no 8-year-old could possibly comprehend the weight of compartmentalization required to be all three. After Sophie was in bed, Hannah sat alone at the kitchen table in the darkness. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need to see herself clearly right now. She'd brought the folded flag home with her, and it lay on the table in front of her, white cloth against dark wood, still perfectly pressed from the ceremony that had taken place in the presence of Marines she'd served with and a chaplain and a military protocol that had nothing to do with Captain Hannah Clarke, RN. She placed her hand on the folded flag and let the tears come. Not in front of Sophie. Not in front of the hospital. Not in front of Dr. Pierce or Rodriguez or any of the people who believed they understood who she was. Here, alone, in the kitchen at 2301 hours, with rain hammering the windows and her mission unraveling and her cover identity crumbling and no one watching, she finally let herself break. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in exactly 7 hours and 15 minutes, she would put on scrubs again and try to save a Marine who didn't even know her real name, and she still hadn't figured out how to get back inside the locked door. The basement storage locker was a climate-controlled cell, tucked behind the laundry chutes where the hospital kept equipment that nobody needed to see. That was where Dr. Pierce had Hannah reassigned on day 20, under the guise of space optimization. Her name was no longer on the ICU roster. Her badge access terminated at 1,700 hours. By midnight, she'd moved her personal items, a change of shoes, a protein bar, the folded flag from a teammate who didn't make it out of Ramadi, into a locker that smelled like industrial bleach and forgotten things. The message came through her encrypted phone at 0412 on day 21. Colonel Vickers, Jensen's recall window closing. 12 hours, maybe less. Medical compromise imminent. Hannah read it once, memorized it, deleted it. She didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table watching Sophie breathe in her sleep upstairs, jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. At 0445, Hannah pulled on her scrubs. The badge wouldn't work anymore. That was fine. She'd breached worse doors than a hospital ICU entrance. She arrived at St. Michael's at 0517, parking in the structure instead of the staff garage. The early morning air was knife-sharp, temperature dropped to 34 degrees overnight, and her breath came out in white clouds as she walked the perimeter toward the emergency entrance. The fluorescent lights inside cast everything in a sickly blue-green glow. The hallway was empty, skeleton crew, night shift still holding the line, day shift not yet awake. A physician in a white coat was badging into the ICU wing, coffee cup in one hand, the other hand fishing for his badge. Hannah matched his pace, fell into step exactly 2 feet behind him, shoulders squared, movements economical. The man held the door open without looking back. Muscle memory took over. She was through. Room 347 was at the end of the east corridor. Jensen lay in bed, eyes closed, the ventilator humming its mechanical rhythm, chest rising and falling in synchronized increments. New monitors had been installed, cardiac, SpO2, blood pressure cuff, the full array of surveillance equipment. The night nurse had been reassigned 3 days ago. The new graduate, fresh out of nursing school, was stationed at the desk outside, charting with the intense focus of someone who didn't yet know what could kill a patient in silence. Hannah stepped inside. The door whispered closed behind her. She performed a visual assessment first, her eyes cataloging what her hands could no longer touch, breath sounds diminished on the right side, percussion dull over the lower lung fields, jugular vein distension visible even lying flat. The monitor showed oxygen saturation at 92%. Heart rate elevated at 114. The missed rib fracture had become something worse. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, pressure building, collapsing his lung inch by inch. The math was simple and terrible. Maybe 2 hours before his oxygen saturation crashed past the point of recovery. She reached for the call button. Nothing happened. No response. 0536, the new grad was still charting. At 0541, Jensen's monitor began to drift. The numbers dropped, 89, 87, 84, 82. His lips took on a faint blue tint. The alarm sounded, a high-pitched electronic wail that echoed down the corridor. Hannah heard chairs scraping, footsteps accelerating. The code button. She hit it. The response would be 90 seconds out, minimum. Jensen's eyes opened, blind with panic, his oxygen-deprived brain screaming a message his body couldn't articulate. His hand groped. She gripped his shoulder. I'm here. 0547, SpO2 at 71%. She moved to the crash cart. The supplies were arranged in military precision, everything a crisis team might need, everything that protocol demanded but regulations forbade a floor nurse from using without a physician's direct order. Hannah didn't think. She opened the cart. The scalpel was where it should be, sterile-wrapped, the blade edge catching the fluorescent light like a mirror. She tore open Jensen's gown. No time for antiseptic prep, no time for the sterile feel that every training module demanded, no time for the procedural choreography that kept a nurse inside her scope of practice. She palpated the intercostal space, 4th and 5th ribs, midclavicular line, and made a 2-inch incision, decisive and deep. Blood welled immediately. Her hands moved on their own, fingers widening the channel, creating a tunnel for what came next. The air hissed out like a compressed breath released. Jensen gasped. His body convulsed. The monitor climbed. 75%. 81%. 88%. 93%. The surgical team arrived at 05 for 9 to find Hannah standing beside the bed, both hands caked in blood to the wrists, her face perfectly calm, the monitor beeping its steady rhythm like a heartbeat restored to the world. Dr. Pierce was 3 steps behind the team, still in the process of pulling on a surgical mask. He froze. His eyes tracked from Jensen to the incision to Hannah's hands and back again. His face went pale, then flooded with color, not the color of relief, but the color of a man who'd just watched the one thing he'd been trying to orchestrate fall apart in real time. "What the hell have you done?" Hannah stepped back. Her voice was level, measured, the voice of a combat medic who'd done harder things before breakfast. Tension pneumothorax. Field thoracotomy. He's stable. The surgical resident moved in, confirming breath sounds on the right, checking the oxygen trend. SpO2 climbing. Holding at 96. This was textbook. He looked at Dr. Pierce. She saved his life. Pierce grabbed Hannah's arm and pulled her into the hallway. The door swung shut behind them. His voice dropped low, pitched so the staff couldn't hear, but his grip was tight enough to leave marks. "You just ended your career. That's practicing outside your scope. That's assault on a patient. That's everything I need to destroy your credentials." His jaw was clenched so hard the muscle twitched visibly. The composure was gone. Only the threat remained. Hannah looked down at his hand on her arm. Then up at his face. She said nothing. Her expression didn't change. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she pulled her arm free, not violently, not with aggression, simply with the unstoppable pressure of someone who'd decided the conversation was finished. Pierce's hand dropped. He took a step back. At 0615, Pierce called the IT department and had her badge access revoked. The security system processed the termination at 0623. Every entry point at St. Michael's locked her out simultaneously, including the main entrance. By 0700, he'd convened an emergency peer review with Dr. Patel, the chief of medicine and his old golfing partner. The decision took 40 minutes. By 0900, Hannah was sitting in HR with an escort from security, her ID badge being confiscated by a woman in a navy blazer who wouldn't meet her eyes, being read her rights to appeal despite the foregone conclusion, being told that her suspension was effective immediately pending an investigation into her violation of scope of practice and her reckless endangerment of a patient. She drove home in silence. The rain started somewhere on the northeast side of the city, fat drops that hammered the windshield like applause for a performance nobody would ever acknowledge. 72 hours. That was how long she had before her civilian cover collapsed completely, before someone checked too carefully into Hannah Clarke's credentials and discovered that her nursing license came with a DoD credential overlay, before the weight of the operation became visible to everyone simultaneously. She sat at her kitchen table at 15:30 when Sophie came home from school, backpack slung over one shoulder, reading response journal tucked under her arm. Sophie saw her mother still wearing scrubs, unwashed, traces of blood still visible on the cuffs despite 3 hand washings. "Mommy, why are you home early?" Hannah heard the worry in her daughter's voice, the fear that accompanied any deviation from routine. She managed a smile. "Surprise, baby. I finished my shift early. Come here." Sophie dropped her backpack and climbed into her lap. Hannah pulled her close, holding her daughter's small weight, breathing in the smell of grass and notebook paper and the strawberry shampoo they'd bought 2 weeks ago. And then the dam broke. The sobs came silently, shaking her shoulders, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her mouth against Sophie's hair to muffle the sound. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from restraint, from the release of every moment she'd held herself together, every humiliation she'd absorbed without response, every decision she'd made wrong and right and impossible. Sophie didn't ask questions. She simply held on. The folded flag sat on the table where Hannah had left it, corners creased sharp enough to cut, the triangle of stars and stripes catching the afternoon light like a small beacon of all the things that couldn't be said, all the sacrifices that bore no recognition, all the missions that nobody would ever know about. Hannah's eyes found it across the silence. She'd lost a teammate to save a patient. She'd lost a patient to keep her cover. She'd lost her career to follow protocol. And in exactly 3 days, everything would change, though she didn't know it yet, couldn't know that the folded flag was about to become the most important piece of evidence in the final reckoning, that Jensen's eyes opening would trigger a cascade of responses from a military apparatus that had been waiting for exactly this moment, that the quiet nurse everyone had dismissed was about to become visible in ways that would shake the hospital down to its foundations. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that for now, in this moment, sitting in her kitchen with her daughter asleep against her chest and blood still under her fingernails, Hannah Clarke was just another casualty of a system that had never learned to value what it couldn't measure. 3 days. That's all it took for everything to collapse and rebuild at the same time. Day 24, 1,000 hours. Hannah stood in the basement locker room at St. Michael's, fingers trembling, not from fear, from rage, as she packed the folded flag into a cardboard box. SSGT Vega's flag. 16 folds, each one precise, each one a prayer whispered in remedy dust. Her dress blues went into the box next. The Navy Cross in its presentation case. A photograph of Sophie at 6 years old, holding a dandelion, smiling at a camera in a world where her mother was just a nurse who came home at midnight smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion. Hannah's jaw clenched as she closed the locker door. The handwritten suspension notice was still taped there. Practicing outside scope of practice. Immediate removal from clinical duties pending peer review. Dr. Pierce's signature looked like a snake. She didn't know that in 3 floors above her, Jensen's eyes were about to focus on her face for the first time since remedy. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Jensen lay in the ICU bed, his brain still clouded from trauma, his body healing from a blast that should have killed him. A Navy corpsman stood nearby, rotating his legs to prevent DVT clots. Afternoon light slanted through the window, turning the room golden and soft. Then something shifted. Jensen's pupils dilated. His breathing changed from the mechanical rhythm of recovery to something conscious, deliberate. His eyes tracked across the ceiling. Found the window. Found the door. Found Hannah as she pushed the supply cart past his room. She froze. Not from fear. From recognition. The way his face changed, the confusion clearing like clouds breaking open, told her everything. Jensen's lips moved. His voice came out rough, damaged by sedation and injury, but the words were clear and precise. Reaper 6. Her call sign. The one she'd buried 7 years ago in Arlington soil. Hannah's hand steadied on the cart. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. The supply cart wheels squeaked against the tile floor, a sound like a wounded animal. In the ICU room, alarm bells began to chime. Not medical alarms. Different alarms. The kind that only sound when classified protocols are triggered. Within 1 hour, a full bird colonel appeared in Jensen's doorway. His uniform was pressed so sharp it could cut skin. His cover was tucked under his left arm. His voice carried the weight of command, of authority that made the air in the room pressure change. He opened a leather folder, official seal visible even from the hallway, and began to read, Citation for Valor in Remedy. Captain Hannah Clarke, Marine Corps Intelligence, 3rd Battalion 5th Marines. Under sustained small arms and IED fire, then Lieutenant Clarke led an emergency extraction of 8 personnel from a compromised position, personally administering combat life-saving measures to 4 wounded Marines while maintaining suppressive fire. Her actions resulted in 0 KIA and the successful recovery of classified intelligence materials. For extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire. Dr. Pierce stepped forward from the corner where he'd been standing, his face pale. Sir, I think there's been some confusion. This nurse. You need to leave this room. The colonel's voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. It was the voice of a man accustomed to obedience. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. He stepped backward into the hallway. That's when the two-star general walked past him. The air didn't just pressure change. It fractured. General Catherine Korengel, Deputy Commander of Joint Special Operations Command, moved into Jensen's room with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had spent 37 years in command. She was smaller than most men, maybe 5'6", with silver threading through her dark hair and eyes that had seen classified things that would never be written in any report. She looked at the colonel. He saluted. She turned to Jensen and placed 2 pins on his bedside table. Brass glinted in the afternoon light. Navy Cross. Bronze Star. Your service is noted, Corporal. Your recovery is honored. Then she turned toward the doorway, toward Hannah, and gave a salute, fist to chest, held for exactly 3 seconds. The room went dead silent. In that silence, a man in a charcoal suit and wire-rimmed glasses entered carrying a folder. Pentagon Liaison. FBI credential hanging from his neck on a blue lanyard. The folder he carried was stamped with a code Hannah recognized, her operational call sign, in red letters, classified TS-CI. He didn't acknowledge Dr. Pierce, who stood frozen in the hallway. Instead, he walked to Hannah and spoke 6 words, "We need to talk. Now." Behind him, boots on tile. FBI field agents, San Antonio Division. 2 of them walked past the colonel, past the general, and stopped at Dr. Pierce in the hallway. One of them was Agent Torres, who had been monitoring Pierce's communications for 8 months. Dr. Marcus Pierce, you're under arrest for fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, and tampering with military personnel records. You have the right to remain silent. Pierce's face went the color of old bone. The handcuffs clicked shut. In the interrogation room at the FBI field office, 40 minutes later, Pierce sat across from Agent Torres. The table between them held printed emails. Bank statements. Deposit records matching invoice dates with pharmaceutical kickback payments from Victor Chen at Surgical Solutions International. $40,000 a month. Every month. For 3 years. You didn't know she was federal, Torres said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the precision of someone who had studied every email Pierce had sent, every call he'd made, every moment of his arrogance recorded somewhere. Pierce tried to swallow. I thought she was just. Just what, doctor? Just a nurse you could destroy to protect your fraud scheme. Torres leaned back in his chair. You fabricated disciplinary issues. You restricted her patient access. You endangered a federal witness under protective monitoring. Your deleted emails show you attempted to scrub her personnel records from the hospital server after Dr. Patel called you, warning you that the Clarke nurse had some kind of federal flag on her file. You panicked. You escalated. And you documented everything. Pierce's attorney had arrived by then, had advised silence, but the case was airtight. Victor Chen had already flipped, providing recordings of 3 meetings with Pierce in a private office at a Marriott near the medical center. The hospital's insurance company was already calculating the settlement. Medical board revocation proceedings had begun within 48 hours of his arrest. He would lose his license. He would lose his career. He would lose everything. What he didn't know yet was that he would lose his freedom too. At St. Michael's, the staff learned the truth in pieces, like a story unfolding in a language they suddenly understood. The quiet nurse who absorbed their contempt, who never fought back, who showed up early and left late, she was a decorated Marine captain. A combat veteran. Someone who had been giving them grace they didn't deserve because that's what she had been trained to do. She had been trained to protect them. Even from themselves. In the break room, the nurse who had been cruelest to Hannah, the one who had made comments about Hannah's attitude problem, her defensiveness, her tendency to not fit in, found Hannah standing at the nursing station, reviewing discharge paperwork for a patient she'd finally been allowed to see again. I'm sorry, the nurse said. We didn't know. Hannah looked up. Her eyes were steady. Her voice was quiet. "You didn't need to know who I was. You just needed to be decent." The nurse walked away, and in that moment, everyone in the hallway understood something they hadn't grasped before. It was never about the title. It was never about recognition. It was about what you did when no one was watching. It was about holding steady when everything was trying to break you. It was about saying yes when every instinct told you to run. At home that evening, Hannah sat Sophie down at the kitchen table. There was a box between them, wooden, with brass corners. Hannah had kept it hidden in the back of her closet for 7 years. She opened it slowly. Inside are her dress blues, still pressed, still crisp. Her medals in their cases. Photographs from Ramadi, images of younger Hannah, thinner Hannah, Hannah with her platoon, Hannah with a rifle, Hannah with something written across her face that looked like purpose. Sophie's eyes went wide. "Mommy, what's this?" "Something I should have shown you a long time ago." Hannah picked up the Navy Cross. Light caught the bronze, turned it into something alive. "I'm a Marine, Sophie. And I always will be. Before you were born, before I became a nurse, I did things that mattered. Important things. And sometimes..." Hannah's voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. It just got quieter. Sometimes important things ask you to disappear for a while. To be invisible. To let people think you're ordinary when you're not. That's called service. Sophie reached out, touched the medal with one small finger. "You're a hero?" "I'm a Marine. And I still am." 6 months later, the White House East Room, 1,400 hours. Hannah stood in her dress blues, shoulders back, chin level, every inch the officer she had been trained to become. Sophie stood beside her, 8 years old now, dressed in a navy dress, holding the folded flag, SSGT Vega's flag, finally honored publicly in a room where the truth could be spoken out loud. Corporal Derek Jensen stood at Hannah's other side, also in dress blues, the H Clarke tattoo visible on his forearm where the world could see it. He remembered everything now. He remembered Hannah carrying him through enemy fire. He remembered her voice telling him to stay awake. He remembered her hands keeping him alive. President Patricia Martinez approached the small group. The room held 300 people, military officers, intelligence analysts, hospital administrators, nurses from St. Michael's who had come to witness the moment when the quiet woman they had dismissed was recognized by the highest office in the land. Captain Hannah Clarke served 2 tours in Iraq with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, the president said, her voice steady and clear. She saved 17 Marines under fire. She extracted intelligence materials that resulted in the disruption of 3 major terrorist networks. And when called to serve again, in a new uniform, in a new role, asked to be invisible, she did so without hesitation. Without recognition. Without complaint. 6 months ago, she saved Corporal Jensen's life a second time, using nothing but training and courage when every system failed her. This nation recognizes her sacrifice today. The room applauded. Hannah's face remained composed, but her hand found Sophie's. The girl held the flag a little tighter. In federal prison, Leavenworth Minimum Security Facility, Dr. Marcus Pierce wore orange scrubs and drove a medical supply van between buildings 3 days a week, delivering gauze and syringes under guard supervision. His medical license was revoked. His assets were seized. 18 months of his sentence remained. He had become what he had always feared, ordinary. Invisible. A man no one remembered. A man no one would ever trust again. At the reception afterward, General Korengel asked Hannah about her next assignment. The question carried weight, an offer, a recognition, a chance to return to the work she had been trained for. Hannah was quiet for a moment. Then, back to nursing, sir. Civilian this time. For real. General Korengel nodded. The faintest smile crossed her face. The Marines' loss. Jensen approached with Sophie, who was peppering him with questions about Ramadi. Hannah watched them, the girl who thought her mother was just a nurse now understanding the weight of the flag she carried. The girl who understood, finally, why her mother's hands were so steady. Why her voice never broke. Why she could walk into any room and command it without raising her voice. Because some people don't need to shout. Some people have already survived the worst that the world can do. Hannah's hand found the Navy Cross, hanging over her heart. She thought of SSGT Vega. She thought of Jensen in that ICU bed, the moment his eyes focused and he said her name. She thought of Dr. Pierce in orange scrubs, driving a van, learning what it felt like to be voiceless. But mostly she thought about what came next. Quiet. Real. Civilian. A chance to be both invisible and seen, to show Sophie that you could be extraordinary without needing anyone to know it. That sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up, be steady, and let your work speak for itself. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, if you've ever held back and been strong in silence, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Like this video. Comment below with your own story of being underestimated. And follow along as we continue uncovering the hidden heroes serving in plain sight, the ones changing lives in the moments when the world isn't watching. Because sometimes the most decorated warriors are the ones you'd never recognize walking past you in a hospital hallway.